Every empire that has ever dominated the world shared one thing in common: a currency that the rest of the world trusted, used, and needed. It wasn't just about trade, it was about identity, confidence, and control. For the past 500 years, 5 different empires rose to the top of the global order, and each one carried a currency that became the world's money. And then, one by one, they fell. What's haunting is not that they fell, it's that every single one of them made the exact same mistakes before they did. The Portuguese Empire was the first to open the oceans. In the late 1400s, when Vasco da Gama found the sea route to India, Portugal became the world's first truly global trading power. Lisbon was the center of the known world. Their gold and silver coin, the real, circulated across Asia, Africa, and the Americas at a time when most of Europe had never even heard of those places. Merchants from a dozen different cultures accepted it without question. Portugal was called the world's shopkeeper. But Portugal had a population of barely 2 or 3 million people. A tiny nation cannot hold a massive empire together forever. The resources ran thin. The navy stretched too far, and by the late 1500s, their dominance was fading. Spain stepped in next and did something no empire had done before. They found almost unlimited wealth. From the silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and the gold of Mexico, Spain extracted so much precious metal that it changed the entire European economy. Their coin, the Spanish silver real, became the world's first genuinely global currency. It was accepted on every continent. For over a century, if you were doing serious international business anywhere on Earth, you were doing it in Spanish silver. But here is where Spain made its first fatal mistake. They confused having money with being productive. All that silver flowed into Spain and caused massive inflation at home. Instead of investing in industry, agriculture, or technology, the Spanish crown spent it on wars, palaces, and maintaining the image of an empire. When the mines started running dry, Spain was left with enormous debts and nothing built to replace the wealth. The currency weakened, the empire contracted. The pattern had begun. The Dutch were next, and they were different in a fascinating way. The Netherlands in the 1600s was not a military giant. It was a commercial genius. The Dutch invented modern finance almost from scratch. In 1602, they created the Dutch East India Company, which was the world's first publicly traded corporation. In 1609, they opened the world's first central bank in Amsterdam. Their currency, the Dutch guilder, became trusted not because it was backed by raw gold from conquered lands, but because it was backed by a functioning, credible financial system. That distinction matters enormously. The guilder was the first reserve currency built on institutional trust rather than just metal. Merchants across Europe kept their savings in guilders because they believed in the Dutch banking system. But the Dutch had a fundamental weakness. They were traders and financiers, not military dominators. When France and England both pushed against them in the late 1600s, the Dutch could not hold their ground. Their commercial empire slowly gave way to those with bigger armies and bigger ambitions. Then came Britain, and Britain did it longer and more systematically than anyone before. From the mid-1700s all the way through to the early 1900s, the British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. The phrase, "as good as gold," exists in the English language because of this era. Britain operated on the gold standard, which meant every paper pound in circulation was backed by actual gold sitting in a vault. At the peak of British power, roughly 25% of all global trade was conducted in pounds. If you were in Karachi doing business with Cairo, you used pounds. If you were in Buenos Aires booking a cargo ship, you used pounds. The pound meant stability. It meant the British Navy would keep the trade routes open. It meant the rules of commerce would be enforced. The pound was not just money. It was a promise, and for a long time, Britain kept it. But 2 world wars destroyed Britain financially. The first one forced Britain to borrow heavily from the United States. The second one left Britain nearly bankrupt. When the Bretton Woods Conference took place in 1944, gathering representatives from 44 nations to design the post-war global financial system, Britain arrived with almost nothing to offer. The Americans held 70% of the world's monetary gold. They set the terms. The dollar was crowned the world's reserve currency, not because America took it by force, but because Britain had spent itself into exhaustion. In 1944, a new world was built in a hotel in New Hampshire. Representatives from 44 nations gathered at the Bretton Woods Conference to design the economic architecture of the post-war world. The decision was simple but enormous. the dollar would sit at the top. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold. America promised the world, 1 ounce of gold equals $35. The world agreed. Why? Because at that moment, America held 70% of the world's monetary gold. No one could argue. America had genuinely earned that position, and for the first few decades, America delivered. It rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan. It rebuilt Japan. It created the World Bank and the IMF. The world traded in dollars, borrowed in dollars, and bought oil in dollars. Then in 1974 came the petrodollar deal. Saudi Arabia agreed that all OPEC oil would be sold exclusively in dollars, and in return America would provide military protection. That one agreement made the dollar more than a currency. It made it a requirement. Whether you were in Tokyo or Tehran, whether you were buying steel or semiconductors, you needed dollars first. Dollar meant access. Dollar meant power. But in 1971, something happened that most people were never taught in school. President Nixon closed the gold window. America stopped honoring its promise. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by nothing except the trust of the world. This is called fiat currency, and every empire on this list eventually did the same thing. They detached their money from reality when reality became inconvenient. Spain spent all its silver. Britain printed money to fund its wars. America quietly removed the one thing that gave the dollar its foundation. From that moment, America began doing exactly what every empire before it had done. It started spending more than it earned. It started printing money when it ran short, and it kept trusting that the world would never stop believing. Today, America's national debt sits above $36 trillion. Annual interest payments have crossed $800 billion more than the entire defense budget. Every year, the government spends roughly $1 to $2 trillion more than it collects. The way it covers that gap is by issuing more debt, which the world buys in dollars. This only works because the world still needs dollars. Economists call this the exorbitant privilege. America is the only country on earth that can borrow in its own currency, print that currency, and avoid the consequences as long as the trust holds, but the trust is shifting. China's economy, measured by purchasing power, has already surpassed America's. China is the world's largest manufacturer and exporter. It has been buying gold at a record pace. Russia abandoned its dollar reserves after 2022. Saudi Arabia has quietly discussed pricing some oil in Chinese yuan. Brazil and Argentina have explored trading with each other without using dollars at all. None of this has replaced the dollar yet. But all of it is pointing in the same direction. The dollar will not collapse overnight. There will be no single announcement, no dramatic moment. The pound sterling did not disappear in a day. It faded across decades. In 2001, the dollar made up 73% of global reserves. Today, that number is around 58%. That is a 15 percentage point drop over 2 decades. Not a crash, a fade. And fades, once they begin, do not reverse on their own. The dollar still has real advantages. America has the deepest capital markets in the world, the most powerful military, and the most dominant technology companies. The yuan cannot replace the dollar because China won't fully open its financial system. The euro cannot replace it because Europe is too politically divided. Crypto cannot replace it because stability hasn't arrived. So the dollar stays on top not because it is strong, but because everything else is weaker. And that is exactly how every empire on this list spent its final chapter. Not losing to something better, just slowly becoming less necessary. Portugal, Spain, and Britain are all still here, but their currency's moment at the center of the world never came back, because once the world starts quietly making other arrangements, the empire at the center rarely notices until it is too late. The pattern has repeated for 500 years straight. The only question left is whether America is writing a different ending, or just the same story with a different name. Subscribe to Finance Origins for more stories like this every week.